Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Hey everybody! You know what? I have decided that I do not really need to do an opening monologue for this episode on writer Cory Doctorow's new novel, Red Team Blues, and featuring our first guest host, historian and sociologist Aaron Benanav, author of Automation and the Future of Work, because how we begin the episode sets up the context for the conversation so well. So I hope you enjoy our conversation, which was a lot of fun for us. And you know what else I hope? I hope you get excited. My guest today is writer Cory Doctorow, the author of over 20 books, including several bestsellers and multi-award winners, and special advisor to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Today, our conversation will focus on his new novel, a taut, neo-noir technothriller called Red Team Blues. But we'll also be trying to put that work in the context of Cory's longer career in thinking, and we'll be talking to him about how he thinks about the nature of technology, politics, economics, power, all the good stuff. It's a big job, but mercifully, I will have help along the way. In an exciting moment for Peoples and Things, this is the first in the series of planned episodes where we'll have a guest host. Today, that person is Aaron Benanav, an assistant professor of sociology and a senior research associate of the Autonomous Systems Policy Institute at Syracuse University. That's right, folks. If you hadn't heard it before, Benanav is no longer a historian, but has become a sociologist. May the angels weep. Aaron is the author of the book Automation and the Future of Work, which everyone should be checking out if they care about the relationship between, say, AI and robots and economies. And you can also check out my review of that book on HNet. I met Aaron in person for the first time a few months ago, and over breakfast we were talking about his new book project on post-scarcity economies. And one of the authors we discussed in that conversation was none other than Cory Doctorow. So when the opportunity to interview Cory came up, I thought it would be great to bring Aaron into the chat. Aaron, can you tell Cory and listeners about your current book project on post-scarcity economies and what you're planning on doing with it?
Sure. And Lee, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be part of a conversation about Cory, whose science fiction writing has been a huge influence on my thinking. And the book I'm working on now about post-scarcity economics is really about the relationship between economics, technology, unmet human needs. And I guess a core idea of the book is to think about how the way that economics teaches us to think about scarcity, to think about it as a conflict between the insatiability of human wants and desires on the one hand and the limits of our resources and technologies on the other, has inspired this really exciting and kind of forward-looking science fiction worlds that have also had a big influence on technologists. So, you know, if you look at Elon Musk, you know, he was naming his SpaceX rockets after the spaceships from the Ian M. Banks Culture series and so on. You know, Mark Zuckerberg once said that Player of Games was one of his favorite books. So like these are really affecting or shaping somehow the worlds that we inhabit. But I also think that there's something very limited about the way that economics gets us to think about scarcity and technology. And I think Cory's books, especially books like Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom and Walkaway, get at some of those limitations. And one of the ways that I think about that is that, you know, in some of Cory's post-scarcity books, like people do live in a world where they've overcome all resource limitations. They're not even, you know, death has been abolished. And yet what happens? Like, are people fully fulfilled? Do they just live lives of pleasure? No, in fact, you know, it turns out that the human search for meaning, the potential for conflict over something as, you know, seemingly insignificant, but if you meet people who love Disney World, something really significant, which is like, what happens to the rides? What happens to the rides in Disney World? How do we preserve and develop them? It speaks to an idea about what human needs are and how to meet them that I think goes beyond actually what current economics can speak to us about. But I think that, future economics and a future vision of the world would really have to take into account that larger conception of what human beings are after and what we should be using our resources to achieve. So that's like a little introduction to those themes.
Yeah, and these themes are going to come up a lot in our conversation. We're going to have a lot of fun today together. This is great. So, Cory, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to Aaron and me today.
It's my pleasure. Man. Wow, that was very exciting to hear. The Ian Banks thing and Musk is just wild. He actually once blocked me on Twitter because I said, when he was talking about this, because I said, I knew Ian and he was an ardent trade unionist and the NLRB is investigating you right now. I don't think you get to call yourself a utopian socialist in the model of Ian Banks when you're doing that. And he said, well, I didn't see any unions in the culture novels. If Banks can see what a Tesla factory looks like, he wouldn't be a union advocate for us either. And I said, there is a world of difference between, trillion-person spaceships that travel at hundreds of times the speed of light, crewed by super intelligent artificial intelligences, and eking out minor improvements in the production of electric cars. And he called me an enemy of humanity and blocked me.
Oh man, the ironies are so thick you could spread them on a cracker there.
Oh my gosh.
So Cory, we can't wait to talk to you about Red Team Blues. You're on a kind of tour right now. When you're explaining it to strangers, what do you say about it, and what were you trying to do with it? What led you to write it?
Well, it depends on whether the stranger is already familiar with my work or not. And when I've been on a book tour, so I'm taking a lot of taxis, and a lot of cab drivers are like, "What was at the bookstore?" And I say, "Well, I was there giving a presentation." And so they say, "What's the book about?" And I say, "It's a crime thriller about Silicon Valley scams." And if they're still interested, I say it's about a 67-year-old forensic accountant who spent 40 years fighting high-tech scams and whose last big adventure is unwinding a scam that has to do with stealing $1 billion worth of cryptocurrency that gets him in the middle of a mob war that is also implicates a bunch of corrupt U.S. three-letter agencies. And at that point, they're either like, well, that's interesting, I'm going to turn my stereo back on, or we end up talking about the book. If it's people who are more familiar with my work, I tend to situate it as like a technothriller and say, this is a book that's kind of a companion to the Little Brother series I wrote about a 17-year-old in Silicon Valley who is living at the sharp edge of how technology can both give you more self-determination and take it away. This is about a 67-year-old who's been fighting that fight for 40 years and is no longer fighting to keep what he values, but is sort of fighting to get back what he lost. And it's a story about how finance curdled the dream of technology as a force for human liberation. And so, yeah, that's how I talk about it.
Yeah, that's nice. Aaron, do you have any first cuts on that?
Well, I think later on we'll talk a lot about the idea of what you just said, how finance curdled the potential of technology to liberate people, because I think that's a really important aspect of the book. But do you think, I was very curious about, your turn to writing about a 67-year-old man who's on the verge of retirement. Like, is this, are you trying to tell us something about your own?
Yeah. Is this a retirement series, Cory? What's going on here?
Is this your goodbye?
I am not an angry young man anymore. I am now an angry old man. I am 51 years old. I have 2 artificial hips. As soon as I can clear some schedule time from book touring, because I have 7 more books coming out, I need to get 2 cataracts removed. My goal is to have all my body mods done before civilization collapses. And I am no longer listening to my elders tell me about how the fights that I'm engaged with are connected to fights that happened in the decades before. And now I am finding myself increasingly in the role of talking to younger activists about how things like the broadcast flag and early net neutrality, peering arrangements, the questions about warrantless access to email and intermediary liability, how all of these things came about, and also trying to revive the imagination of critical technologists. And, Lee, I think this is where my work intersects with yours some, because there is in the techno-critical world a kind of amnesia about what we did have and what we might have again. There is a species of techno-criticism that says that Facebook is like the apotheosis of how we'll talk to our friends on the internet. And to fix the way we talk to our friends, we have to fix Facebook and not abolish Facebook, right? We see this a little in the European Union, where they passed some landmark legislation, the Digital Markets Act, that requires interoperability for large services. And it has kind of got a list, a priority ranked list of where they're going to impose those interoperability obligations. And they started with end-to-end encrypted instant messaging, which is like just a weird and really dangerous place to start, because encryption in instant messaging has been a hot potato since the Clinton years, right? Since the Clipper chip fight about banning working encryption. In 1992, the Electronic Frontier Foundation won the Bernstein case in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that found that code was a form of expressive speech protected by the First Amendment. And so the NSA's ban on working crypto violated the First Amendment. Part of that was building a computer that could brute force the cipher that the NSA wanted people to have. That computer was called Deep Crack, and it is sitting next to me. John Gilmore, who built it, was tired of having it in his garage and asked me if I wanted to become its steward. So I'm sitting next to a thing the size of a bar fridge, filled with things that look like cryptocurrency miners. They're ASICs, right? Massively parallel things. So the stuff just keeps coming back around and around.
Yeah.
The European Union is going after end-to-end encrypted messaging, even though a small error could put people all over the world at risk. Remember, it was an error in WhatsApp in the code that allowed the NSO group to build a cyber weapon that the Saudis used to lure Jamal Khashoggi to his death. And you could completely discredit the whole project of interoperability by introducing a small error. They're trying to do it on this really short timeline. And a lot of people are wondering, like, how is it that the European Union is starting there and not with something like that feels like much lower hanging fruit, like social media? And my theory is that maybe, there's like spooks or cops in the European bureaucracy who want defects in secure instant messaging. But I also think that, like, if you're like the median Eurocrat, you know what it's like to take your phone with a German SIM to Brussels and send a message to a Dutch colleague on holiday in Spain and just have it delivered. And you think, oh, interoperable instant messaging must be very easy because I experience it every day. Of course, SMS is a fucking dumpster fire, and like it is so dangerous and bad and needs to be killed with fire. Whereas, these people like either are too young or were not technically advanced enough to have ever used something like Usenet or FidoNet, where you had federated social spaces. And for them, it's like water that's not wet. How would you have a social space that was not governed over by someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or whatever, right? And they are just, it's just a blank for them. And so they're starting with the thing that's hardest and least urgent and has the highest likelihood of destroying the whole project. And they're leaving to one side this very obvious and very urgent project of making social media more interoperable. And, to watch them do it is baffling. I actually made a piece of design fiction called Interoperable Facebook with EFF that's basically a user manual for a fictional version of Facebook that has been forcibly federated by regulators. And it's about how you as the end user would use it, how it would be compatible with privacy law and so on. Because I really feel like we've had this great extinction of memory of what we can do with technology. And now it's like people arguing about how we resolve the climate emergency by arguing about what price carbon should have instead of arguing about whether or not certain activities should be permitted at all. And I am here to try and make this debate more robust and historically informed. And that, I think, is what it means to be an old person in this fight, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Just to get a couple more playing pieces from the book on the table. Well, I mean, Aaron, you really like the kind of heterodox economist character, Raza. So, I mean, yeah, talk about that for a second. Aaron, go ahead. I mean, what do you think about Raza?
Yeah, I was really curious about that feature of the book. Like one of the kind of themes of the book is that the main character, Martin Henge, he's been living and working as a forensic accountant, kind of like looking at how money moves and tracing its movement through cryptocurrencies and fiat currencies all across the world, to tax havens and into different mobsters' accounts and so on.
Yeah.
And you know, towards the end of the book, or really, you know, one of the characters of the book, who he's friends with, is Raza, his heterodox economist friend. And I was kind of curious, like, who the inspiration for that was. If you're thinking of a particular, if Raza is a kind of, you know, if she's a you know, doctrinaire of like a particular heterodox framework, or, you know, and it provides a kind of, in some strange way, it provides a kind of key. You know, there's a key there to the book, but the readers are kind of, in some way, they're not, Martin's given the key, but in some way the readers are not. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, yeah, Raza is kind of an amalgam, at least intellectually, of two people I have a lot of time for. One is Stephanie Kelton, the woman who wrote The Deficit Myth. She ran economic policy for Sanders, teaches in New York. And Kelton is a modern monetary theorist. I know that this is an idea that the left is skeptical of. I think that as like... even if you don't buy the prescriptions of MMT, which fair enough, they're up for debate, that normative stuff about MMT, where they say like where money comes from is governments spend it into existence. And then when they tax money, they throw the taxes away and then they make new money. Like, that's just not up for debate. That is like literally how it works, right? And there are some profound implications for leftist projects that revolve around that, but you don't have to like buy those implications or even care about them to just say like, this is just true, right? We got to stop talking about federally funded projects as being funded with taxpayers' money. It's not funded with taxpayers' money, not least because the implication of something that's funded with taxpayers' money is the more tax you have, the more you're entitled to, right? It becomes like a frequent buyer club for federal programs, which means that nobody should ever get food stamps because, like, by definition, people who get food stamps are not paying a lot of federal tax. And so, like, they're not entitled. They haven't bought 10 boba teas. They don't get the 11th one for free, right? That's just something Warren Buffett should get, you know, not that he pays any federal tax. But one of the other critiques of modern monetary theory, especially from the left, is that it doesn't have any application outside of the American empire, that it particularly doesn't apply in the global south. And there you have the other part intellectually of Raza's, kind of inspiration, which is Fidel Kaboub, who's, I believe, Tunisian theorist of MMT, who's written a lot about decolonization and MMT, and the role in particular that debts denominated in foreign currencies have in retarding projects of post-colonial independence, right? If you need dollars to service the debts the IMF imposed on you, or, you know, francs if you're Haiti to pay France for the freedom of the people who bought their way out of slavery and paid until the 1980s to pay off that debt, then you have to sell the things that you could otherwise use to countries that have dollars in order to cover those debts, which means that you just drain your own coffers, you drain your own real resources to do this. In terms of the role she plays in the book, you know, one of the things about MMT and its relationship to orthodox economics is MMT grows out of accounting, right? Like the way that MMT thinks about money is as a series of accounting identities. Like, what is in the ledger, right? What number do you put here? What number do you put there? And what relationship do they have to each other? That's the core of MMT. It's weirdly connected to cryptocurrency and its obsession with ledgers. And accounting is the blue collar end of economics, right? Economics is the elite white collar part of the trade, right? But bookkeeping and its big brother accounting, that's a thing working class people do, right? And it is a thing that working class people have a connection to too, right? We all know a bookkeeper helps us with our taxes or whatever. And so in terms of thinking about what economics and other elite technical endeavors like technology itself, like computers and networks and so on, what they do for us and whose perspective is considered when they're designed and discussed, accounting has a lot more connection to the lives of everyday working people than economics does. There's this famous line that if an economist wanted to know about horses, they wouldn't go out and look at a horse. They would sit in their study and ask themselves, if I were a horse, what would I do? Right? And accountants don't have that luxury, right? Accountants live in the details of how this stuff works. Accountants have conversations with business people who say, well, why isn't my cocaine habit an allowable expense, right? And have to actually like address that question. So, Marty Hench, like the protagonist of this book, his story is that he moves out to Silicon Valley in the 80s after dropping out of MIT and going to a 2-year accounting program in order to kind of live his obsession with computers and their potential, and has for 40 years tried to nurse that hope and excitement, even as over and over again through his role as an accountant, he's found all the bad things that technologists and their enablers do with money. I mean, basically, his story is that when he was 18 years old, he enrolls in an accounting program and discovers a bunch of people who are excited about how they're going to use spreadsheets to hide money. And he's like, I'm going to use them to find money because I'm smarter than you guys. And that's where he's been, right? He's been playing the red team. He's been finding the one mistake they made and unraveling it through very complex and competent, very diligent study of what they do, just checking all the numbers, checking all the columns. There's someone the other day, Annalee knew it's called this competence porn, not in a negative way. It's despite the word porn in there, it is a not necessarily a negative way of talking about literature when we say competence porn. And he is very competent, and his competence is being very careful and being very knowledgeable, right? And it's I'm just writing an editorial this morning about the California Public Utilities Commission discovering that it has the legislative authority, the regulatory authority, to end all prison price gouging for calls, video visits, and scanned letters, right? This is a thing the feds have really struggled to regulate for years and years, but the California PUC can do it, right? And they've opened hearings. And it's like, there's this very disheartening thing, right? Where something terrible is being done by a company and a regulator steps up and says, we will end this. And then it goes in front of a judge and the judge says, I'm sorry, you don't have the power to do that. I'm just throwing this out, right? And it just makes you feel like, oh, they've rigged the game, right? Like since Reagan, they've just gone through and they've gutted the legislative authority, the regulatory authority of everyone who could intercede between us and companies. And all we have is like voting with our wallets, which means rich people get more votes than we do. And then you find these people, I call them photocopier kickers after that joke, right? $75 to kick the photocopier? No, kicking the photocopier costs $1. $74 is knowing where on the photocopier to kick, right? These photocopier kickers who just know exactly where the authority is and how to use it. And that's what Marty is. He's a photocopier kicker. He's just like really good at being very careful and reading all the documents. I think of that scene in the terrible Batman and Robin movie where the Penguin, I think played by Danny DeVito, reveals that he's got the documents that reveal the secret plot that was that's going to bring down the governor or the senator, whoever it is, because he shredded them and flushed them down the toilet. And of course, he lives in the sewers and he has found the shreds. And he says, all it took was 10 years and a lot of sticky tape. And he holds up these sheets of paper that have been painstakingly taped back together. Marty has got that kind of Six Sigma limbic capacity to be very careful and methodical and not get bored and just do this stuff that like so many times on the internet we see emerging as a kind of superpower,
And yet, like with the Raza character, it's interesting because I think you're also, Marty's very limited in all kinds of ways. You know, I mean, he's a human. And one of the ways, though, is that this accounting work he's done has given him a good sense of the details and where all the bodies are lying. But he kind of misses the big picture, right? And so that was one thing I was like, he doesn't see the big picture.
He's down in the weeds, and Roz is up in the clouds. And, you know, this is the macro-micro split among all economists, right? Are you thinking about how the argument proceeds in the boardroom, or are you thinking about how the policy emanates from the apparatus of state? So, yeah, he's very much in the weeds. And then the other thing about him is it's not just Raza. Marty doesn't solve a single problem on his own. Like, nowhere in this book does he solve any problem on his own. He relies on this ensemble of other people who help him out. And in that regard, I think he's a departure from the typical noir hero who is, you know, like, yes, this is competence porn, but one of the things he's competent at is recognizing when he needs help from other people and approaching those people with humility and taking their help. This is a point that Paul DeFilippo made in his review in Locus magazine. And you know, one of the most exciting things as a writer is reviewers who find things that are undeniably true about your book, but that you didn't know. And this is definitely one of those things where I hadn't really thought about that, but it's absolutely true. And you know, I think it's a theme that runs through a lot of my work. You know, you mentioned Walkaway earlier, Aaron. It's you know, all the characters in Walkaway solve problems as an ensemble. Nobody is you know, the single competent man. You know, there's no in fact, all the villains in this book and in Walkaway and in most of my books are people who fancy themselves the heroes of Ayn Rand novels, right? Who have a singular vision and are just going to solve the problem on their own. Everybody else has to shut the fuck up and get out of their way.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the Ayn Rand worshippers, there's something, you know, in the acknowledgments to the book. You acknowledge all the people who helped you along the way, but then you give a special thanks to the crypto grifters for giving you such fertile soil to plow. And I was wondering, you know, there's a lot here about crypto, and there's a beautiful way that the book is able to move between the crypto grifters and money launderers who are, you know, hiding money all around the world with these crypto tools. And then, you know, the day-to-day life of all of the homeless people in San Francisco. There's a lot of attention focused on the opposition between great wealth that's hidden and incredible and ubiquitous poverty. But yeah, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, you know, sometimes it feels like the book is like a spite book about how crypto took over and how, as you mentioned before, crypto finance in particular has kind of turned technology in a really negative direction. And I guess, you know, my particular interest is in that when I've given talks about, you know, post-scarcity and the potential of technologies to liberate us, for many years now, there's always been one person in the audience saying, yeah, but isn't crypto really the future? Because instead of having limitless copies of things that everyone can share, we can like gatekeep those things and monetize them. And instead of, you know, everyone enjoying art, you know, we can have art that only one person owns, even though it can be infinitely copied. And, you know, so people can make money off of that. And there's this kind of way that I also feel like there's a kind of denaturing and something almost really perverse in the whole Web3 conception with regard to the future of technology, that it seems like this book is really in some ways like a reaction to.
Well, I think perverse is the right word. And so, you know, I'll start with the stuff that I share with crypto people. Because when I listen to crypto people talk, I often hear things that rhyme with the things I say. Decentralization, spreading power around, privacy, and so on. And it's in some ways not dissimilar to the things that I hear sometimes out of conspiratorialists' mouths, right? I just wrote a thing called The Swivel-Eyed Loons Have a Point, about the anti-15-minute city protests in Oxford, which were deranged, right? But also, we're like, if they put automated license plate recognition cameras all around Oxford to limit vehicular traffic, that could be used as a police surveillance dragnet. Like, yeah, 100%. If they institute a central bank digital currency can be used for financial censorship and for surveillance. Totally, right? The fear that there will be quote unquote climate lockdowns that will be used as a pretext to limit the movements of everyday working people while elites violate those rules with impunity. That happened during COVID lockdowns in the UK. The Dominic Cummings, who was responsible for that program in the UK, broke the rule, drove 250 miles, and then took a detour to a castle while people were like locked indoors, not able to visit their dying relatives. Boris Johnson, who was prime minister at the time, threw party after party after party, these huge booze ups that, at a time when people weren't even allowed to visit the gravesides or the funerals of people who were dying. It's not wrong to say that this stuff is going to happen. And when I hear crypto people say centralization, financial interdiction, centralization in financial processes that allow states or other powerful actors to decide who can and can't have money, the centralization of moderation decisions and so on, that these are wielded in ways that are unaccountable and often sinister. It's not wrong, right? But then I look at their methods and I look at kind of their epistemology, like what they blame this on and what they think will solve it. And it's incoherent in every way. Like, it's incoherent economically. I just don't think money works the way that they think it works. This kind of gold bug thing where money begins in the public, where someone can't make change for a cow and chickens, and so they just spontaneously start using gold, and then the government comes along and takes away the gold. Like, it just never happened, right? That's just like not where money comes from. It's not how money works. So just like as a plain matter of like fact, that's wrong. This idea that inflation arises from reckless money printing as opposed to real resource constraints that are themselves downstream of the decision not to spend, right? Like, it's very hard for the economy to have enough things to buy if there aren't highways and educated people and hospitals. Those economies do not produce the real goods that are themselves the constraint on how much money we can have, right? Like, because you can't buy things that aren't there. And if you try to, then you have bidding wars and prices go up. So they're wrong about that. And then they're wrong, like, just technologically. Like, the ledger doesn't do what they say it does. NFTs don't work the way they say they do. And, I was giving a talk at a bookstore in Miami, and there was a woman in the front row who was asking me about NFTs, and she said, like, can't we resolve a lot of these problems with NFTs? And I just said, like, well, NFTs don't establish ownership. They don't establish copyright claims. They don't pay royalties. And she was like, no, yes, they do. And I was just like, well, look. All an NFT is a URL inscribed in the ledger with two identities, right? So Cory Doctorow, URL, Lee Vinsel. And then we interpret from that Cory Doctorow made the thing at the URL and gave it to Lee Vinsel. But maybe I just took some other URL and put it there. There's no way to check that. And then maybe I add a smart contract to it that says whenever this work changes hands, a royalty will be paid to Cory Doctorow. But that smart contract is just a computer program that like has a thing that says if an event called a sale occurs, then kick some money to Cory Doctorow. If I run that in an exchange that doesn't call the thing you and I would call a sale, they call it a sale _1, that subroutine just never triggers, right? And there is no law that requires that you use that exchange. And if there was a law that did it, we wouldn't need the smart contract. We could just have a contract and we wouldn't have to burn down a forest every time someone wanted to buy some art, right? So like, even if you take them on their own terms, they're just wrong. And the fact that so many useful hours were wasted, so much money was wasted, so much energy was wasted, so much confusion was sown. And really, like, so many people's naive but absolutely correct sense that things were screwed up and needed to get fixed were then turned into this thing that comes out of hard right conspiratorial economics, this like Austrian, gold bug economics, like real, like, this is like straight out of a Heinlein novel, right? Like, you should stockpile gold bullion and thumb drives full of crypto is like, it's just it's like wrong in every way as like an economic matter and as a way of solving our problems. And a lot of what I think about right now in my political work, both in the technical work and in the wider projects of a better world, is like what do we do to redeem the redeemable people who got sucked into this, who do care about decentralizing power, who do want a better world, but found themselves in this wrong thing. And that's what, I mean, a lot of this book is about, like, why crypto is not the solution to a problem that we should care about.
Yeah. I was reading this book, and you're not 67 years old, but you're not a young guy either.
No. Yeah.
And I was thinking about, like, the education of Cory Doctorow, and I was thinking about your whole career and where this novel fits in it. So I was thinking, like, all right, let's start with, like, you've been long affiliated with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF, and the EFF starts off as very anti-regulation, mostly focused on government, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah,
some people call it cyber libertarian. There's certainly libertarians affiliated with it.
Yep.
But then later we see this shift in, you wrote this recent book, Choke Point Capitalism, how big tech and big content captured creative labor markets. We see this concern rise around centralized power in the form of monopolies. And you become concerned about that. So, I mean, I think this happens in general for EFF. A lot of EFF folks are like, okay, we're focused on government, but these things, there's a lot of centralized power here too. And then, I think about Little Brother, a book I really loved when it first came out, and I read it, I remember very vividly. And, you've been affiliated with cypherpunks, and the people who put a lot of hope in cryptography. But, then you have this character in this new book, Danny Laser, one of the main characters, who's, a crypto maybe billionaire. How much he's worth is open to interpretation. But he starts life at a cypherpunk, some great computer history museum references in here about his cypherpunk interviews. And so I just wondered, like, we go from EFF kind of libertarian, focus on government. Then there's this concern about big tech. Cypherpunks, there's some hope there. But then, dude, they take your ciphers and your crypto and they turn it into, like, this bullshit, right? And so I wondered, I'm just thinking about you, man. It's like, you've been doing this for a long time. Tell me about the education of Cory Doctorow, know?
Look, I was a spittle-flecked, excitable adolescent using an Apple II Plus in the 1980s. Actually went to elementary school, a little weird alternative school in Toronto with Tim Wu, who went on to coin the term net neutrality. And there's some weird parallels between our two careers, which is quite fun. And my folks were leftists. They're Trotskyists, organizers, politically active. My dad's a computer scientist. We used to go visit my grandparents in their seniors community in Fort Lauderdale. And because there was nothing to do, we'd drive to Disney World and we'd basically have conversations about, like, what Disney World would be like if it were run like Project Cybersyn. What would a people's Disney World be if you could bring all this, like, incredible automation and sort of thoughtful, creative technology to a more popular framing, which is, how you get down and out in the Magic Kingdom. I was a science fiction fan. I grew up in the shadow of a brilliant woman, Judith Merrill, who was an organizer, writer, editor, and critic, who, after the 1968 Chicago police riots, she had divorced Frederick Pohl. She took their kids and went into voluntary exile in Canada. And brought she and Pohl's library and donated them to the Toronto Public Library System, where they formed the nucleus of what's now the largest public science fiction reference collection in the world. And she was the writer in residence. We took a school trip there when I was like 10. And she said, hey, kids, if you've ever got a story you want me to critique, you can bring it down and I'll critique it for you. And I knew her partly because my dad knew her from anti-war circles, but also because when my mom was in teachers college, my dad would babysit me, not babysit. When my dad would be home with me and my brother, we would watch Doctor Who, and she used to introduce Doctor Who every week on public television. Whoa. And say like, when I was living in the Futurian polyamorous science fiction leftist house in New York, we came up with this idea. She was like Slappy Squirrel, you know. Ray Bradbury was in town, and he was fucking Harlan Ellison's girlfriend, and we were having a spaghetti dinner, and C.M. Kornbluth drank too much wine, and he said, "What if?" And then we all wrote 11 stories about it and sold them all to like 10 different science fiction magazines. And so I kind of knew her. And she had talked this local fan into starting what's now the oldest science fiction bookstore in the world, which I ended up working in. The thing she did at our local public broadcaster turned into this incredible science fiction television show about science fiction, not a science fiction show, but a show about the industry and its ideas called Prisoners of Gravity that I consulted to. Like, she had this movable feast, this social thing that happened every 6 weeks called Toronto Hydra that I was like hugely formative to how I got to know people in my milieu. And then she started these writers workshops with the writers who would come and bring her manuscripts, and I ended up a part of one of those writers workshops, still going the Cecil Street workshop, and Peter Watts and Carl Schrader, Madeline Ashby, all these writers went through it. We're all Judy's kids. So I ended up in kind of science fiction and this kind of radical tradition because of that. So I had computers, I had science fiction, and then through that I got involved in reading cyberpunk. It was the 80s. And through there, I started reading Bruce Sterling. Through that, I read The Hacker Crackdown, which is Sterling's history of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mm-hmm. I also had an old pal from Radical Summer Camp who was working in an anarchist bookstore in Montreal who sent me the Whole Earth Review Cyberpunk issue, which like blew my mind. And so I got on the Well, and I knew about EFF through the Whole Earth Review. I read the thing Barlow wrote about Operation Sun Devil and the raids that the Secret Service conducted, and the Steve Jackson Games raids. I was a gamer, so I knew about Steve Jackson. And then I just became like EFF was just this thing that was this very important institution in my life when I did a startup in the late 90s that was doing peer-to-peer free and open search called Open Cola. And we got kind of incidentally embroiled in the copyright wars because of what was going on with Napster. Our programmers were Cult of the Dead cow programmers who'd been defended by EFF. And they put me in touch with EFF. I ended up working with them to like cool out our VCs. And at a certain point, I just quit the startup and went to work for EFF. And then I fought all these fights with EFF, and it's a bit like it's a bit like the meme the Galaxy Brain meme, right? Where like you're viewing it but not in a sarcastic way. You're viewing it in the micro, kind of at the coal face. And then the more experience you get, the broader your horizon gets. So, the first thing I fought was the broadcast flag, which was, which would have basically given the FCC the power to, restrict any digital technology that wasn't endorsed by at least 4 movie studios. So like you couldn't build a computer or software unless at least 4 movie studios greenlit it. There was some complex formula with movie studios, cable operators, and TV studios. It was, just bananas. The FCC actually made the rule. Michael Powell, Colin Powell's son, made the rule, but then we sued them in the Second Circuit and won. Or maybe it was the DC Circuit. It was the DC Circuit and won. We just got involved in all these fights where winning got harder and harder and harder, and we were losing because there was increased concentration. Like the reason the entertainment industry kicked the tech industry's ass in the Napster wars is because there were like 7 entertainment companies and there were like 100 tech companies, and in aggregate their turnover was orders of magnitude larger than the entertainment industry, but they got in each other's way. Right? Like they wanted different things, and some of them would sell out. I used to call them Vichy nerds, right? They would sell out to the entertainment industry on their terrible anti-privacy demands, right? Where you have to surveil everything your users do to prevent them from infringing copyright. And then when the tech sector became just as monopolized as the entertainment sector, not only did they no longer have their users back, but like we also just started losing all of our fights, right?
Yeah.
And moreover,
That's interesting.
It became like the last scene of Animal Farm, right? Where like the entertainment industry and the tech industry had indistinguishable agendas for tech at a certain point. There's a thing we talk about in Choke Point Capitalism, that the scams that YouTube does to musicians as a tech firm are indistinguishable from the scams that Spotify does to musicians, where Spotify was designed by Sony, Warner, and Universal, who were the major shareholders in Spotify, right? It doesn't really matter who's exploiting you, right? It's not that like tech is kinder to you or entertainment is kinder to you as a creative laborer, right? The thing that determines whether someone is kind to you is whether they have to be. This is why that, doctrine that if you're not paying for the product, you're the product is just foolish. Right? Companies don't like treat you kindly because they respect you because you paid them. Think about Elon Musk and his $8 weirdos, right? Companies treat you well because they're disciplined by some combination of regulation and competition. Nothing else causes them to treat you well.
That kind of brings me, and this is like, this is kind of one place I wanted to get to, especially with Aaron here, is just, I felt like, well, how does this relate to your post-scarcity books, the new book? And I was thinking like, it's not, I don't want, the term near future science fiction is not getting me what I want, because you've done other books that feel near future, but this one felt like really, there are moments of it that are really gritty and really putting our face in the inequality and the problems of today. And I was just wondering, how you think about the relationship between this book and your kind of more bigger picture post-scarcity texts. Yeah.
Well, I mean, those books like Walk Away, and the book that I've got coming out in November, The Lost Cause, which is about a post-Green New Deal counter-reformation, where there's an uprising of it's a coalition of like white nationalist militias and seasteading libertarian freaks who are into cryptocurrency, and about how the people who are in the Reformation deal with it, who breathed a sigh of relief because they're finally addressing the climate change with the gravitas that it deserves, and now seeing that all snatched away from them. Those books are parables, right? They're metaphors. And I think that, this book is also a parable and a metaphor, but it's maybe more of a simile than a metaphor, it's a lot closer to reality, but it's still a kind of trying to raise the same ideological points, right? Which is that, creating scarcity for the sake of economics puts the cart before the horse. Is that scene in the beginning of Walk Away, where they invade a factory for something called a communist party. That's not a political institution; it's a festival, right? They say being at a communist party doesn't make you a communist any more than being at a birthday party makes you a birthdayist. And I
was wondering about that because my friends and I we in 2009, when they raised the tuition at the University of California, we started this like movement to occupy university buildings and stuff, and there's like a video of someone at one of these big dance parties that we held in occupied buildings, where someone shouts, "This is what a communist party looks like," and then the beat drops. There's like a kind of techno thing. When I read the beginning of Walkway, I was like, "Whoa, this is like my life in literature."
I didn't know about that.
My life.
I mean, I'd seen the old T-shirt that says "Communist Party." It's got Lenin and Marx and maybe Mao blowing party horns. Or Lenin and Marx and someone Che or something. So, and it says Communist Party, but, there's this little, diatribe in that where one of the characters says like, look, this factory has the raw materials, the skilled workers, and the capital, the machinery needed to make things that people want, but the spreadsheet says we can't. And that this, like, we have now taken the thing that's supposed to, well, this isn't said, but this is the implication, that the thing that was supposed to help us understand how the system works has become the system, right? That we have become perversely beholden to the model, right? This is like, I actually do this all the time because I have no sense of direction. I have terrible spatial sense. staying in a lot of hotels because I'm on a book tour, I will never turn the right direction out of the elevator to go to my room. Doesn't matter how many times I've been to that room. I will end up walking to the other end of the hallway before I figure it out. And drives my wife crazy because as soon as sat-navs were invented, GPS, I just put one in the car. I actually bought one and traveled with it for rental cars before they had them in rental cars because I just couldn't follow a map. And I just follow this blindly wherever it leads me. And there have been multiple occasions in which we've like nearly driven off a bridge because I've been like, well, we just have to do what the GPS says because I am not capable of understanding directions beyond what the GPS says. And, you know, economically, we have fallen into that trap, right? There are so many instances in which the spreadsheet says no, and you know we have the capital sitting idle, we have the need, we have the stuff, we have the feedstock, and we're just like, well, if the machine says no, I mean, you know, the most grotesque version of this is empty houses.
Yeah,
right? Where
amen.
Just holy moly, what could be more grotesque?
Aaron, I feel like this is right at the heart of your project, actually, this problem of the spreadsheet and how we get stuck on these models, right? I mean, this is right at the heart of what you're trying to critique.
Yeah, I guess, you know, before talking about that, I wanted to ask Cory about, I'm not an expert in science fiction, but I've been trying to read a lot of the kind of post-scarcity literature. And I guess I want to ask you about two possible analogies to what we're seeing in your work. Like one would be thinking about the trajectory of the Strugatsky brothers. You know, they start off writing a book like Noon 22nd Century that's like a bunch of funny short stories about spacefaring communists who accidentally end up in a post-scarcity future and like the hilarity that ensues as they try to use all the machinery of this new world. And then, you know, by the 70s and 80s, they're writing books like Roadside Picnic, where that beautiful future is now this, you know, this zone that's basically like full of brilliant technologies, but that like no one can understand. You know, humanity is just like scavenging through paradise, you know, to make a few bucks. Like the dream of that, what's in Noon 22nd Century is kind of gone. And I wonder, like, is it, you know, is there something here about how, like, with a visionary sense, we can see the way to a very different future, but you know, as reality impinges on us and we become aware of the forces that are kind of like, you know, blocking our paths and how powerful they are, how powerful these gigantic governments are, corporations that are controlling a lot of what happens, you know, that there's something there about, yeah, like how hard it is to get to the future. And I also wonder there, like when I read Walkaway, I was thinking a lot about Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age, you know, and which is also a book like Walkaway about how maybe because we face such incredible obstacles and the rich are so powerful and states are so powerful, there's something about the need to think about like how complex the transitions to a better future might be and the kind of like surprising pathways and dead ends and, you know, the unexpected even technological openings that might, you know, by falling into the hands of, I don't know, a homeless person might somehow, you know, create the events that unexpectedly lead us into a brilliant world. And I guess I'm sort of wondering about those, aspects of your trajectory as a sci-fi writer.
Well, I talked before about like the activist project of reawakening people's imagination. And I think that a lot of political debate it sometimes gets, I think, misclassified as culture war stuff, but it's about imagination and about what can and can't be imagined and considered plausible. So think about Margaret Thatcher and There Is No Alternative, right? Like, which is really like it's a demand dressed up as an observation, right? What it really means is don't try and think of alternatives. Not it is impossible to do so. And you know, I think that likewise, you know, the corollary of that is the outcome we have predicted for this project is inevitable, right? So they're both forms of inevitabilism. Like, you know, the capitalist project will produce abundance given enough time, right? Just like we just have to do, we just have to capitalist harder, and we'll get there. And so something like Roadside Picnic is really a story about how it could go wrong. It's a way to kind of counter the anti-imaginative imagining, right? The thing that says there's only one way to think about how this project ends, to project it forward. I was once on a very memorable science fiction panel with Robert Silverberg, who's this great sort of golden age science fiction writer, about science fiction and its supposed predictive power and what it really means. And the subject of Heinlein came up, and he sniffed, and he's very urbane. He's got a little spade beard. He's very, quiet, very dry sense of humor. And he says, "Oh, yes, Robert A. Timeline." Because Heinlein had all these timelines in his books showing you what the future was going to be, right? And not just the hard right characters like Heinlein, but also like Asimov and Harry Seldon, and the idea that we can predict the future to 3,000 years out. And there is like a very political act in claiming that the future is contingent, right? Without it making any specific claims about what the future will hold, just saying that what the future holds is up to us is itself like a very powerful statement. And inevitabilism is such a sin in our technical discourse as well. Mark Zuckerberg wants you to think that like it is inconceivable to talk to your friends without being spied on, and Google wants you to think that there's no way to have a search engine that doesn't surveil. And yet, like, both of these companies, when they started, didn't do surveillance, and in fact disclaimed surveillance, and grew to the point where they could surveil with impunity because they were so large and successful that people couldn't imagine leaving them by not surveilling, right? So like we who are you going to believe, Mark Zuckerberg or Mark Zuckerberg in 2006, right? When he said, "Stop using MySpace, come start using Facebook. We're better than MySpace. We don't spy on you, and we never will," which was his pitch in 2006, right? So I like this role that science fiction has, and I think historians really get it, and historian science fiction writers are a very special subcategory of writers who do this really well. And I always mention in this context my colleague Ada Palmer, and Ada is she's a tenured Renaissance historian at the University of Chicago, quite heterodox. She had an anonymous blog called Ex Urbe that she did not reveal her authorship of until after she got tenure because it was so controversial, where she wrote about Florence during the Inquisitions, which is her area of study, homosexuality, witchcraft, heresy, and so on, and how the Inquisition related to them. And she is famous at UC for doing this annual project where she has her undergrads spend 4 weeks LARPing the election of the Medici's Pope. And each undergrad is given the identity of a real cardinal or a member of a great family. And they spend 4 weeks like horse trading and betraying each other, making alliances. And then there's this fake Gothic cathedral on campus, and they rent it out for the climax. And she has costumes for everyone. She's got a Google alert for theater troupes that are selling off their costumes. She dresses them all up in Renaissance Florentine drag. And they go into the cathedral and they invest the Pope. And in the final four every year, 2 of those characters are always the same, because there is a great force of history bearing down on that moment that determines that these 2 are definitely going to be in the running. The other 2 have never been the same, right? There's never been a repeat of the other 2, because human action changes what happens. History, even history operating under the constraints of the forces of history, is contingent on human agency. Right. And I think that that's what science fiction's at its best does, is it reminds you in that Luddite way that what the technology does isn't nearly as important as who it does it for and who it does it to. And there's nothing about what the technology does that determines who it must do it for and who it must do it to. Like those are choices that are often disguised as technical inevitabilities. And in so many of our policy debates about tech, we have regulators who don't understand tech very well, who demand things of tech that it just can't do, right? So this is like, make us cryptographic systems that are strong and secure, that won't let criminals or foreign spies or griefers or stalkers break into your data and do terrible things to you, but make it fail instantaneously if a cop needs to see what's inside of it, or a spy, right? And when technologists go to governments and say that's not a thing that anyone can make or will ever be able to make, they do this thing that we in policy circles call nerd harder, right? Just go out and figure it out. I got faith in you guys. You're wizards, right? And the problem with the nerd harder response, right, with saying, oh, well, you're just telling us to nerd harder, is there are other times when policymakers demand things of technologists that are possible, which they insist are impossible, like interoperability, like privacy, and so on. And they say, oh, no, that's as impossible as making cryptographic systems that work except when you need them to fail. And when the regulators or policymakers say, no, we think you can, we go, you're just saying nerd harder. And like, you need to have the praxis to be able to distinguish between the times when technologists insist that something isn't contingent and is in fact inevitable, like either crypto works or it doesn't, from the times when they're just bullshitting in order to, get some goodies for themselves.
Well, guys, I know we could do this for like 8 more hours and not even run out of steam. We'd probably have to get drinks at some point, but this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for doing it with me today.
Yeah. I'm going to be in Charlotte's, somewhere in Virginia.
Okay.
I think where Virginia Tech is in October. Maybe we can see each other.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
And Aaron, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a lot of fun, bud.
Yeah, Aaron,
thanks for having me.
Lovely to talk to you. I'm so honored that you're doing this work that implicates my own. That's so cool.
Yeah. And Cory, can you just say, I've been very gratified to see you use the criti-hype concept a bit. Can you just say, it struck me that you found it useful, and I just wondered how, you found it useful.
Well, look, I think that there are a lot of people who are or could be comrades with whom I have disagreements with. And those disagreements, they turn on their lack of technical nous that leads them to believe that the tech companies aren't lying when they claim that certain things are impossible, or when they claim that they're doing certain things that are not what they're doing, right? Yeah. And that started, I think, with the copyright wars, where there are a lot of people who really care about artist rights, who think that it is possible for tech firms to like distinguish between copyright infringement and not copyright infringement, who often, when they critique the tech firms, say, well, look, they're able to do X, Y, and Z, which they're not doing, right? They say, oh, well, look, they've got automated AI moderation that can stop harassment. Why can't they stop copyright infringement? It's like, well, they don't have the AI tools that can stop harassment.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just a lie they tell to Congress about why they're not paying their moderators, right? Why they don't need to pay more moderators, right? Like, it's just not true. And so, you can't accept it at face value. And I think it reached its apotheosis in the post-Cambridge Analytica era with Zuboff and with her fellow travelers, who took the tech firms at face value when they claimed that they were evil wizards who'd figured out how to hack dopamine loops, and who just like warmed up a bunch of largely discredited Skinnerian nonsense, and which they themselves may believe. And then kind of use that as the basis for a critique that gets you precisely nowhere, that in fact gets you somewhere worse than nowhere. In the case of Zuboff, the thing that I found most alarming about her book is what I call the night of the comet problem, where she says, look, they've invented mind control rays. We know because they put it in their patent applications, not understanding, I guess, that patent applications are the locus of just like the most absurd bullshit that tech actually issues. It makes their press releases look like sober by comparison, because if you can trick a patent examiner into believing the nonsense in a patent application, then you get like a treatable asset. You don't just get some like PR wins. And she says, well, if they've got mind control rays and we break up the tech firms, this is like exploding the comet that's headed towards Earth, that just turns it into a million meteors that destroy every city, right? We have to steer the comet, right? We have to perfect Mark Zuckerberg or replace him with a better Mark Zuckerberg, but not like shatter Mark Zuckerberg, not shatter Facebook into 1,000 companies. And I think that that's actually worse than useless, right? I think that model of constitutional monarchy where Zuckerberg gets to reign forever, but he, allows himself to be drained in kind of golden chains by an aristocracy composed of regulators who've cycled out of the tech companies and are now going to spend a turn as wise stewards to them instead of the effectuators of them. I think that's just so dangerous in terms of like just enshrining that dominance forever.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, guys. Thanks again.
Thank you. And thanks for talking about the book. I'm really excited about it. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. It means a lot.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. People's and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other People's and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire People's and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.